looking at the fundamental responsibility of a president of the United States, responsible for the security of this country, failing to have a rapprochement with the People's Republic of China at that time would have been inexcusable and unacceptable, because frankly we needed them just as much as they needed us. And if we didn't have that rapprochement today, I repeat, we would be in an impossible position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. You take the Soviet Union, you add the billion people that are in China with its enormous resources, and the whole balance of power in the world tips irreparably against us. And that is what we are helping to prevent.
Okay, well, I want to start off by introducing our panel. From my far left, former Deputy National Security Advisor and a star of Washington's strategic class, Matt Pottinger. Then we have from the Vandenberg Coalition, Carrie Filipetti, and the lead author and architect of the 2017 Grand Strategy for the United States, Nadia Schadlow. And I am Eli Lake of the Free Press. So I want to start off with that quote, and I want to start with you, Matt, and ask, what do you think? Do you think that Nixon's idea that we have to have a balance of power with totalitarian states is still applicable today as it was in the height of the Cold War?
Eli, it's good to see you, and good to see Carrie and Nadia. Great to be with you. Look, I think the logic of the quote that we just heard made a great deal of sense. What Nixon was seeking to do was to ensure that we weren't facing an overwhelming competitor in the form of a combined Sino-Soviet axis. The part of the quote that we didn't hear, he went on to talk about how it's only when you have a balance of power where one state is not significantly more powerful than others that you have peace. I think that's the only part of the quote that Nixon uncharacteristically got wrong. And I think it was because of the context of the time when he said that quote. That was really at the height of the détente period. We had just lost the Vietnam War, and the U.S. was starting to think about whether we could manage even usher in a more multipolar era where we hoped having equal power between the United States and its adversaries would somehow add up to peace. I think probably in Nixon's later life, since he made that quote in 1977, his later life, I suspect that Nixon would have revised himself in light of the fact that history has shown that a balance of power, a true balance of power, is actually a very dangerous thing. It's often the prelude to war. And in fact, it is when you have a very lopsided difference in power that peace tends to prevail. And so that's why it's so important for the United States and its allies to be perceived as having a significantly lopsided advantage over the new axis that's formed. Again, this time with China playing the role that the Soviet Union played back in the 1970s, Russia, North Korea, Iran as the primary members, but I would even add Venezuela at this point, since all those powers are mucking around in Venezuela right now and have just stolen an election from the Venezuelan people.
Carrie?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Matt, and I would say that this is all further complicated by the fact that in Nixon's time, or in our time as opposed to in Nixon's time, we're not really looking at regional geography as being as critically important as it was back then. With cybersecurity, with the cyber sphere, it is no longer really possible for us to think about balance of power in the same way, because people are able to influence us here at home through disinformation and propaganda. So I think that adds a very unique new element to how we think about these issues that wouldn't have been as true in Nixon's time.
Nadia, what do you think?
I agree with Matt, but I think maybe I have a slightly different take. So yes, I agree with Matt that essentially you want U.S. preponderance of power in these three regions of the world, but Is that possible today? I'm not so sure. We have to strive for it, but our relative power is declining and has been declining. And the National Commission on Defense, actually, if the audience is interested, it's worth looking at. There's some alarming language in there. But having said that, I think what's important about the concept of balance of power is that it's a constant effort to keep it in play, right? And we need to remember that. And so I think Matt would agree with me. It's not that we're necessarily going to achieve preponderance at any given moment, but we have to strive for that, and we constantly have to do that. The status quo is not static. To maintain a status quo, to maintain U.S. power means a constant set of activities, and I think that that's important to keep in mind.
And I would add that the United States right now is not striving sufficiently to reclaim or to sustain that preponderance of decisive power that Nadia was just describing. We've seen a decline every single year of the current administration. We've seen a real decline in defense spending. It's exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing.
Exactly.
Well, let me kind of continue on this and pose a challenge. Oftentimes, American leaders of both parties have talked about a rules-based international system. Is a rules-based international system possible with aggressive totalitarian states like China or the former Soviet Union, or states that exist in many ways that outside of what we would consider to be sort of whether it's the laws of war, the laws of trade, or for that matter, trying to come up with the new rules of the road for something like cybersecurity? Is it possible to have both, which is to say, can we have a balance of power with totalitarian states and also have that an international system ruled in some ways by international law and not just simply by terror and the balance of fear?
No, I mean, I think it's more accurate to say, first to ask the question, whose rules? And if we want them to be our rules, then we have to actively fight for that. We have to actively shape. We have to actively influence. But having said that, we need to acknowledge that we might need to shift more toward a multilateral system with coalitions of like-minded countries. If you compare Biden's speech at the UN, which was the most, it was just it was just filled with one trite phrase after another: multilateralism, human rights, everything was chock full in there. And look at Meloni's speech, the Italian Prime Minister's speech, in which she acknowledged that Western values matter, and that I think it's a very interesting and important comparison. So ideally, we want a system that reflects our rules. We want a system that advantages us and our allies. We have to fight for that through the system, but acknowledge that other powers are seeking to change that all of the time. And we may need to end up with a different sort of order in which we're building coalitions, creating positive alignments, and maybe keeping some out of the system.
Carrie?
Yeah, so to expand on what Nadia has said, so first of all, I hate the term rules-based international order only because as a conservative, there's a lot of words in that I don't love, like liberal rules-based international order does not necessarily, that is not the combination of words that I am drawn to, but the theory behind it is essentially what I would call the American-led system. So to Nadia's point, that this is about whose rules are we talking about. When I was growing up, my mom used to always say the same G.K. Chesterton quote, which is, you should be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out. And that's kind of how I would describe the multilateral system, which is that back in the past, and Matt can share even more details on this, China saw entities like the United Nations as essentially purveyors of this American-led system, and therefore they didn't want to engage actively in it because they felt engaging within that system meant that they were inherently providing more credibility to the American-led system. What they subsequently discovered in the early 2000s was actually we can take advantage of this system. We can take advantage of the freedoms that the Western world is trying to promote and try to manipulate it and sway it closer to our worldview. This is, we see them getting involved in campus protests to try to undermine American social cohesion, for example, and trying to benefit off this idea of freedom of speech and all of that. So I think it really depends, and it relies on the West to be willing to actually stand up for the very principles and the purposes of those principles that initially formed these things. And we haven't been doing that. You can see this very clearly with how China manipulated the entire international system through the World Health Organization during the onset of COVID. You also see it in the resolutions that are put forward in the UN on Russia, which typically don't talk about the egregious Russian invasion of Ukraine, but instead condemn things like American sanctions for causing food insecurity and things of that nature. So it's not that the system is the problem. The problem is that we're not willing to stand up and defend the original purposes for that system.
Matt?
Yeah, I would just say that I think that the small number of aggressive, autocratic, even totalitarian countries that we've been talking about have shown that they are vandalizing the American-led system. They every day they make a mockery of the founding charter of the United Nations and the four freedoms and the things that we were pulling them into. But that doesn't mean that the whole system burns down. It means that we should, that these countries are in a sense excluding themselves, and so they shouldn't have the benefits of free trade with rule of law countries. They shouldn't have the benefit of having so much of a vote in UN bodies and the like. But look, one thing I want to lay out is that even as you have this totalitarian axis, I like to call it the axis of chaos, because Xi Jinping famously, maybe not famously enough, gave a speech in 2021 where he said the most important characteristic in the world today is chaos, and that trend's likely to continue. And he goes on in that speech to say that these trends favor the Chinese Communist Party. And then he went to visit Putin last year in the Kremlin, and he said, "You and I are the ones driving these changes that we haven't seen for a century." So by his own admission, I think really Xi Jinping is an agent of chaos. We know that's true of Iran. We certainly know that's true of Vladimir Putin's Russia. Therefore, we should be mindful of the fact that the United States and our allies together account for about $60 trillion GDP each year. Okay, $60 trillion. Russia is maybe $2 trillion. Okay, even if you add China and Russia together, they are of a little less than 20 trillion. So that means that they're about a third of the size of the United States and its defense treaty allies. It's simply that we are not showing the will and focus to bring our superior might, economic might, political might, technological innovative might, military might together to really contain this axis.
Okay, I want to move on, and it sort of leads into the next topic, which is, I mean, we see right now a new front opening between Israel and Lebanon, and we've seen in Gaza. And I want to just play on this point before we get into the nuts and bolts of this conflict. We've seen a jiu-jitsu move in some ways by the axis of chaos, which is to say that Hamas, which is a proxy of Iran for all intents and purposes, and Hezbollah, certainly even more of a proxy of Iran, exist outside of international law, and yet it is Israel in its response to their aggression, which is literally in the dock of the International Court of Justice, and I think the ICC too. And so in some ways, I just want to sort of ask, like, what is the strategy for dealing with this inversion of international law in some ways? You have one side that no country is perfect, but one side that it aspires to live under and to abide by international law, and another side that seeks to flagrantly exist outside of it. And yet it's the party, the country that abides by international law that finds itself, under the microscope of these international institutions. So what is the best strategy for countering that? And I can start with you, Nadia.
Well, I think I'll start by what I think has been a problem from the start, which is identifying the problem. And this administration did not identify the problem as a problem between Israel and Iran. It did not characterize the war as a war between Israel and Iran, which is effectively what it is. It began in a very narrow way, that this is a war between Israel and Hamas. And if you look at the region and consider it as a war between Israel and Iran, all of a sudden you have a whole set of options that aren't, maybe they're being discussed between closed doors, but strategy making begins with an assessment of what is the problem. And that would have been the beginning for me, looking at it as in that light. It creates a whole bunch of different strategic options for you, operational options, different approaches to the problem. Now we're getting to that, mainly because we can't avoid it as the war is expanding, but that's not how we started to look at things on October 7th. But you're an expert too, Eli, on this region.
Carrie?
Yeah, I mean, I would answer this in a couple of different ways. One, it is important to me as an American and as a Jewish American and as a Zionist American that the United States and our allies, especially Israel, do try to adhere to the highest possible international standards. And I think, by the way, that's not a criticism of Israel. I think it is. I think the problem the problem is that we're not holding non-state actors accountable to the same things that we're holding Israel accountable, or rogue states. And part of the reason we're not holding rogue states accountable is because there seems to be this consensus position among both the Biden administration, but then also some of our European allies, that essentially accountability equals escalation, right? If you hold a country accountable for its crimes against humanity, then that equals escalation, and that will lead to direct war. And what this administration wants to do, above all else, is avoid a direct confrontation with Iran.
Let's put a pin in that, because I do want to get back to the escalation question.
Yeah.
But
so
Matt,
I think that's the sort of guiding factor here.
But Matt, I want to just kind of go to you and put a point on this, which is that if institutions like the International Court of Justice are manipulated by countries like South Africa and others to basically, scrutinize and potentially penalize a country that was just attacked in a horrific way, that is our ally, do we have an interest in an International Court of Justice at that point? Or, is there a way to reform it?
No, I think we can never be a party to an organization that supersedes American law.
Okay.
In our own revolution and through our Constitution, we'd be surrendering our sovereignty, and frankly, we have a more perfect system. We strive to have a more perfect system, but it is a much more perfect system than what you're seeing with the ICJ today. So we can never really be a party to it. I still think we should try to shape some of these international bodies from the outside.
Okay. All right, so this leads to the next question. I mean, the Middle East is sort of the big front right now. We'll get to the other great power conflicts soon, but let's talk about the approach of de-escalation, which has been the buzzword since October 7th, nearly a year ago. Nadia, you mentioned that the administration has failed to understand Iran as the actor behind this, and the conflict's really Israel and Iran. But what is your assessment of this idea that at every turn, it seems like the message has been de-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate?
Well, I think it's a view of how you see power and how you see the demonstration of power. And if you see power and the demonstration of power as also potentially stabilizing, really to go back to Matt's point early on, that a preponderance of power can actually create stability, that's sort of the way I see the world, but it's not the way the Biden administration sees the world, right? It's just a flip side view that a show of power can be escalatory. Sure, everything comes with risk, but we've seen what weakness also does, right? The world essentially is in flames, and America's perceived as quite weak.
Carrie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a message that's being communicated not only to the American people, but also being communicated to our adversaries. And I think what's important is that when we consider what our approach should be to our adversaries, we understand what has been effective in deterring them in the past. And frequently, with the adversaries we're speaking about, specifically Iran, what has been most effective in deterring them has not been sanctions, relief, and negotiations. It has been maximum pressure. It has been a combination of sanctions, a combination of credible threats. A good example of this, and we're going back a ways, but is the tanker war, right? During the Iran and Iraq war, one of the major battlegrounds, as we're seeing now with international shipping, but the Houthis, was obviously over shipping lanes as well. And when the United States finally decided to come in and get involved and basically destroy the Iranian naval fleet, that was when they ultimately decided that they were no longer going to pursue their aggressive actions. Up until that point, we had failed to deter them. We saw it as well in 2012. Strong sanctions against the Iranian regime is what forced them to ultimately come to the table to negotiate. So we need to understand what they respond to. And the Iranian regime right now knows that the Biden administration is so terrified of escalation that we're not going to hold them accountable. And that in and of itself is increasing the probability of that escalation and increasing the probability of a larger, more kinetic, direct confrontation.
Okay, as the moderator, I want to steel man that for just a second and come back to you. What about the argument that the mullahs don't care about whether their people are miserable? The Chinese communist regime doesn't care if their people are miserable. Certainly Vladimir Putin doesn't care that Russia, absorbed all these sanctions after he invaded Ukraine. So maybe we're not really pressuring these regimes because the regimes themselves don't have the same relationship to their citizens the way that open societies do. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so it's a couple of different things. So one, it's not just, when we talk about maximum pressure, I don't think we're only talking about economic sanctions.
Okay.
I think when you look at some of the things that the United States has done, they have been the kinetic sort of actions, whether it was the killing of Qasem Soleimani, whether it was the tanker war that I mentioned. So I think there needs to be a combination of those things. What the sanctions do is it reduces Iran's ability and adversaries' ability to use funds to pursue the things that broadly will threaten the United States and others. So I think it constrains their resources, which is very beneficial to American interests. Okay. And then the other thing I would say is I don't think it's true that they don't care about what their people think. When you see the instability that China is concerned about, when you see the instability that the Iranian regime is concerned about after the Masa Amini protests, these are all things that they don't care until it becomes a potential internal threat to the regime, and that's what they're most worried about. And so I do think they care a little bit. It's just a much different bar and standard than we have in democracy.
Matt, I want to get to you because I want to get your assessment of something which is very much related to this. We've heard so much about this new axis. I love that phrase, the axis of chaos. We've seen all kinds of agreements. We don't really know exactly what it means between China and Russia. We've certainly seen the Iranians providing drones and other kinds of arms to Russia for their Ukraine war. So we've seen a lot more cooperation. Can you give me an assessment of exactly how strong this new alliance or axis is between, the biggies, Iran, China, and Russia?
Yeah. Look, I think people were slow to recognize how powerful this axis could be, mainly because it's such a weird mishmash and mismatch of ideologies. You've got a theocratic, pro-terrorist state in Iran. You've got Vladimir Putin trying to recreate the Russian Empire like he's a czar. Back from the grave. Xi Jinping is still running the last major Marxist-Leninist dictatorship, and yet they have some things in common. They view the United States as the primary obstacle to them achieving their regional and global aims, and so that turned out to be enough of a cause for them to start cooperating. You mentioned a couple of things. Look, there were a couple of headlines this morning I saw. One was Al Arabia had a story about how Iran is brokering a deal to provide the Houthis in Yemen with advanced anti-ship missiles from Russia so that they can, completely, work around the U.S. Navy's missile defense systems. There's another headline. Reuters had an exclusive this morning that Russia is secretly building long-range attack drones in China. So they are working closely enough together that we've got a serious problem on our hands. Now, what have we done to actually impose costs other than on Russia itself by providing some of what the Ukrainians need to bravely defend Europe and Ukrainian sovereignty? What have we done to impose costs on China? Nothing really, other than we had a very important statement at NATO. A transatlantic alliance went out of its way to say that China is now the decisive enabler of the largest war in Europe since 1945. But there have been no costs imposed on China. Iran has not had costs imposed on it for all of the kamikaze drones that are killing so many men, women, and children in Ukraine. So this is a problem of focus. It's a problem of a lack of will, and it's also a problem of this ideology that you started your question with, this fraudulent ideology of de-escalation. I would add that it's now bankrupt, just in light of the fact that all of our claims that we just want to de-escalate. It hasn't worked. The paradox that President Biden has struggled to grasp is that you have to show that you have the means and resolve to use force in order, paradoxically, to achieve some stability and peace. But we're just not seeing that from the Biden administration, unfortunately.
I think I would just add that it's something that our adversaries are also looking at and watching and writing about. So if you look at the Russian press and at the Chinese press, I haven't looked at the Iranian press, they're noticing our weaknesses. They're noticing that we're stepping back. They're noticing that we are not taking concerted action against this axis of chaos that they're creating. And I think that that's kind of an interesting dimension to this too. They're writing and noticing. They're perceiving American weakness. They note what our press says about that weakness, about our inability to supply when we need to supply. So that's another element too that I think we should look at.
All right, so this is a kind of a wild card. I want to start again with Matt, but then we'll go through the panel. Is there an opportunity for creative diplomacy with regard to this new axis of chaos, or is that just a John Kerry fever dream?
Well, look, of course, there's always opportunities for diplomacy, but diplomacy works best when it's backed by credible military capabilities and demonstrated resolve to use them to defend our interests. I would like to see more work to build a coalition for trade and technology that excludes the People's Republic of China. I think there's more that we could do on that front. I credit the EU's president, Ursula von der Leyen, in trying to actually build up tariffs. They're still far short of where they need to be to actually make a dent and to begin protecting European jobs and industry. I mean, European industry is going to get wiped out by the People's Republic of China if they're not careful. The United States is already moving ahead. Even President Biden, who had campaigned against President Trump's tariffs, ended up embracing them and even increasing them in the area of electric vehicles. So we need to. I would like to see that tariff wall open a big gate to Europe, but only if Europe's willing to build a bit of a fence to protect their industry at the same time. Then we can actually enhance our trade and technology ties with our friends and allies.
All right. Well, Carrie, let me put a finer point on this. If you just look at the even recent history going back 200 years, there's no good reason why Iran and Russia should be allies. Russia humiliated Iran in the 19th century during the Great Game. Is there a potential at some point to try to maybe throw a wedge into that alliance?
I think there's certainly a number of spoilers, as you mentioned. I think it's possible to look into those spoilers and try to exacerbate them. The problem is that right now we have seen that the unity of those three nations in in their objective of antagonizing and undermining the United States is way more important to them and way more unifying to them than any of their other disputes. So you would have to shift that specific calculus in order to do that. I think one of the ways to do that, by the way, is through, once again, establishing credible threats to deter them from, if Iran is penalized for its direct support for Russia, if Russia is penalized for its support for the Iranian nuclear program, that is part and parcel of their calculus going forward. So is it possible? Yes. Do I have a huge amount of faith that the United States and our allies are going to come up with what that can look like? At this stage, no.
Okay, Nadia. Is there an opportunity to make American diplomacy devious again?
Well, the adjective's important, right? Muscular diplomacy. We have to think about what our objectives are,
yes.
Right? So what are we striving for? What objectives do we want, and how do we use our diplomacy? I'm probably much more of a fan of that muscular diplomacy, to Carrie's point, of looking at how we can create internal problems in some of these regimes. Iran is very, very weak in terms of its ethnic groups. We don't probe enough into that area. There are many ways that we could create problems for all of these regimes. So there's always room for communication. There's always room for keeping channels of communication open. You don't want inadvertent war. I agree with that. And organizations, UN bodies can be useful for keeping channels of communication open, but they're not so useful for actually operationalizing solutions and getting to where we need to be.
Okay, I want to move that's a great answer, by the way, and I want to move to great power competition and kind of remind of Machiavelli's great dictum that there's always a crowd, everyone's always watching, and I'm thinking of the disastrous execution of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Matt, are we still watching the ripple effects of that humiliating withdrawal?
Certainly. I mean, look at the timing. Why did Vladimir Putin choose, early 2022 to launch a full-blown war? It was 6 months after the United States had its ignominious retreat from Afghanistan, and this is the same pattern we saw back in. Remember, I think it was it 2014? 2013 is when President Obama failed to basically enforce his red line against Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime using chemical weapons against its own people. Guess what? It was exactly 6 months after that, in early 2014, that Vladimir Putin began his invasion of Ukraine, starting in Crimea. So I think there's a direct correlation. Someday we'll have access to the Russian archives, one hopes, and I think that we'll find that was a watershed moment.
Can I
Carrie.
just add? Yeah, I'll add something onto that, because what Matt says is really important, and it's not just a coincidence of this 6 months. If you look at, there's a figure that those of you who follow Russia know, there's a figure, Nikolai Patrushev, who is now an aide to Putin, who was, up until earlier this year, the secretary of the Security Council in Russia. He said 6 days after America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, 6 days after, he said, look, did the fact that Afghanistan was a major ally to the United States outside of the confines of NATO mean that the United States was willing to support its democratic partners there? No, they abandoned Afghanistan, and they're going to do the exact same thing with Ukraine. He said that publicly. So what Matt points out is not just this sort of coincidence observing from the perspective of here in the United States. This is how Putin and his team specifically see the Afghanistan withdrawal, and I think that continues to inform not only Putin, not only Iran, but also obviously China as well.
And we're continuing to support the Afghan. We're supporting the Taliban government. We're providing millions and millions of dollars of aid to a government that just burned all of the musical instruments in a country that has nothing, to a government that is now preventing women from speaking. It's actually horrific. We are continuing to support that government.
Not one person lost their job in the United States for the Afghanistan debacle. It reminds me of Army officer Yingling, who years ago said, a private will suffer worse consequences for losing his rifle than a general will for losing a war. So this was a disgrace for the United States, and we're still paying for it right now.
We need to watch how the Afghan Commission on the Hill now unfolds, and I think it's important for people in this audience to watch that carefully.
Absolutely. I want to move to Ukraine. There has been some, what you might call boastful remarks from the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, that he would end the war before he even took the oath of office for his second term, if he won. But what is, I'm not going to ask you, I understand it, but what is a realistic strategy for the United States if there was a change in the administration for either supporting Ukraine? Is there an opportunity maybe for a deal? Is there, let me start with you, Matt. What would you do on day one if you were back at the White House in terms of how to deal with this Ukraine war?
Well, look, if I were advising President Trump, I'm not. But if I were, I would say, look, let's test Vladimir Putin's bottom line. You can open up a conversation with him. If he disappoints us, and I think you'd have to give him a pretty short timeline to show whether he really does have much of any interest in ending this war on sustainable terms. If he disappoints, then I would advise President Trump to significantly increase his support and aid for Ukraine. So the less peace-minded Vladimir Putin is, the more war he'll get on terms that are increasingly favorable to the good guys.
Carrie?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. I think number one, it's critically important that we remove any existing restrictions that we have on the use of American equipment, to go into Russian territory. Because of course, the only thing that we'll get, if everybody's speaking about a negotiation as being the ultimate end to this, obviously the number one principle is you want your side to go into that negotiation from a higher position. The only way that we can do that, the only way that the Russian government will feel, that they have to give up anything is if they feel that they are being threatened. So I think we need to remove those restrictions. I think we have seen how throughout the history of this war, there have been specific moments in which delayed American equipment, once it reached the theater, was able to decisively change the outcome of significant battles there. And so we know that it's critically important. I'm grateful that this Congress was able to unite to provide assistance to Ukraine. I think that obviously needs to continue. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the Ukrainians continue with their sort of counteroffensive into Russian territory, and what factor that plays in. So I agree that this probably does not end in a decisive military defeat of Russia. I think it ultimately ends at a negotiating table. Our objective needs to be that we get it to the point where Ukraine is in a high negotiating position such that both Putin and Xi, who is an audience to all of this, understand that invading a sovereign nation will not redound any benefits and in fact will only provide consequences.
Nadia?
I'd say I agree with Carrie's point. Battlefield conditions matter. And so going into a negotiating discussion, it matters where you are on the battlefield, and that's what we're now setting up. Two, I think Trump basically likes to say things to achieve leverage, to get leverage, to seek leverage. The media, tends to go crazy, but fundamentally, that's the way he thinks. And three, we're not talking about the Europeans here, right? Trump's often criticized for creating problems with the Europeans. The Europeans, their sustainment of support for Ukraine is, depending on the country, questionable. Look what's happening in Germany. The percentage that the European countries are giving are anywhere from 0.1% of GDP to 0.7% of GDP in terms of aid. So it varies quite dramatically. So Europe matters here too, and creating that sense of a coalition vis-a-vis Russia, I think it's lacking on the European side too.
Okay. I want to move on to China, and this is Matt's, I'm going to start with you, Matt. One of the great, I would say, achievements of the Trump administration was turning the enormous battlefield carrier, air carrier of the American ship of state around in terms of its overall engagement and strategy with regards to China. And part of that was a recognition that we need independent supply chains for critically important industries. We're now, I guess you could say that Biden has continued that. How would you grade our progress on that longer-term strategy of securing our supply chain so that we are no longer so economically linked with China when it comes to important things like medical supplies or computer chips?
Yeah. So, look, it's notable that the Biden administration sustained the majority of President Trump's approach on China. That is really what showed that we do have something of a new baseline and a new consensus that is supported by the American public. Poll after poll shows that. I think that the Biden administration did something very well that shows a template for what we need to do more broadly. What they did was in the area of high-end semiconductors, they imposed even more stringent restrictions than we had put in place in the final year of the Trump administration to ensure that China cannot acquire the equipment, both the chips, but also the equipment for making high-end chips that they would need to achieve their stated goal of dominating all the high-tech industries that depend on cutting-edge chips. So that was a really good move. The problem is that it has not been replicated across dozens of other sectors of the economy where Beijing has a similar plan of achieving domination by their usual game, stealing intellectual property, subsidizing businesses, pricing things low enough that no real market players can compete and they end up going out of business. And then China uses that as leverage to dominate our economies. And so I would grade the Biden administration very highly on what they did on high-end semiconductors. I would not grade Washington, D.C. as a whole very well right now on our supply chain approach overall. We are still heavily dependent on China for many of the most critical inputs into our national defense. This is a really grave oversight, and it's gonna really hurt if China decides to turn the screws.
Nadia, I want to get your thoughts on this.
Well, I agree with Matt, but I would even go further and say the problem has been across the board in implementation. So even on semiconductors, we've taken, in a sense, defensive action, slowing China down. But if you look at the CHIPS Act and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other efforts to revitalize manufacturing here, the ideas are right. The ideas are correct in many ways, not everything in the IRA, of course. But it's implementation that's continuing to be the problem. What has actually been built? Where has ground actually been broken? It's very, very hard to get that information. In addition, there's a real disconnect of this administration not being willing to make trade-offs. So it doesn't want to do more mineral processing here. It doesn't want to do more mining here, even though the United States has a lot of these critical minerals here. It's unwilling to make those trade-offs of between climate and between national security. I think that will change in a Trump administration, but even a Trump administration will run into this problem of implementation. I did a study recently on critical minerals. We've been talking about this problem not for 10 years, not for 20 years, not for 30 years, but for 40 years as a government, since 1980, and I probably could have gone back to the 70s. Where our Department of Defense identified vulnerabilities in critical minerals for that long. So this is a problem across the board. An executive order is a hope, it sets a direction, but it is not implementation.
Carrie.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, obviously I agree with Nadia and Matt. I would say when it comes to China, one of the biggest things that I always try to focus on is that this is not just, a lot of, at Vandenberg we try to work with sort of everyday Americans who are not necessarily tracking national security as closely as all of us are. And often when we speak about China, we're speaking about semiconductors and all of these things, which matters astronomically. We speak about Taiwan, which matters astronomically. we also have to remember and acknowledge everything that China is doing against our homeland right now. This is not a question of, is China ultimately going to start killing Americans if we have to go in to defend Taiwan. It's China is actively killing Americans every day right now through the supply of fentanyl precursors to Mexican cartels that make their way up. And then we've had almost, over 100,000 deaths every year because of opioids, of which fentanyl is sort of 70 to 75% of those deaths. So it's important that we understand that when we're talking about countering China, so much of it has to do with our foreign policy, yes, but also our domestic policy, because everyday Americans are being affected by this. Any of you who have children, the CCP is consistently funding not just higher education, which the China Select Committee just came up with a fabulous report about what the CCP is doing to fund education and what dual-use technologies they're receiving as a result of that, but also K through 12. So an organization, Parents Defending Education, has done remarkable work identifying what China is doing at the high school level, including here in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia. So I think we have to, when we rate the Biden administration, it's not only rating them as it relates to the foreign elements of this, but also as it relates to all of these domestic elements where we've seen an increase in Chinese influence, a decrease of sort of American control over not only our energy supply chains, but also over pharmaceuticals and other things that China controls. So that needs to be a factor of the discussion as well.
All right, well, I want to stay on China, but move more to the kind of hard power decisions. At this point, is America doing enough, Matt, to make sure that Taiwan is taking the steps to defend itself, to become that, unswallowable porcupine? And is it doing enough in terms of its diplomacy to try to make it so that we do not get to that point where war breaks out across the straits?
Matt just wrote a book on this, so.
I know, that's why I started with him.
I did. Thanks for the ad. I just wrote a book that really uses the metaphor not of a porcupine, but a boiling moat. Taiwan has this beautiful advantage in that it's got 100 miles of ocean separating it from this would-be aggressor. And I just imagine what Ukraine would have given to have had 100 miles of ocean between it and Vladimir Putin. So my co-authors and I lay out a bunch of steps, but I think it really starts with hard power. We've looked at how even incremental improvements both in Taiwan's and the United States and also Japan's capabilities designed to deter, hold at risk Chinese naval and other capabilities around the Taiwan Strait. Incremental increases in capability have outsized effects in terms of the problems they create for Chinese war planners. So the advantage of being a defender, especially a defender that's got the benefit of 100 miles of ocean between it, is that you don't have to match the Chinese military ship for ship, missile for missile, airplane for airplane. You simply have to deny Beijing the ability to achieve dominance, naval dominance, air dominance around there. And you could do that in a cost-effective way. So anyway, I could talk for a long time about what those specific steps are, but they're all laid out in the book.
All right, well, we'll have to check it out.
Nadia.
Nadia.
A quick add to that would be to watch, and I don't know what Matt thinks about this, but the Replicator Initiative, which is an important initiative that DoD has undertaken to essentially create thousands and thousands of drones to be used in a Taiwan strait situation. However, again, let's watch the implementation. Let's see if that's successful. I want it to be successful. I'm a patriot. I think DoD should be doing that. But the key is whether or not it will be. And if it fails, that also just sends a bad signal to China. I don't know, Matt, what you think about the initiative.
I fully agree with you. Look, we should have great empathy for Admiral Sam Paparo, who's the American commander of our Indo-Pacific Command. He's going to be the top warfighter in the event that we go toe-to-toe with China. I want him to have multiple different options for how to win a war. And then I want us to advertise some of those capabilities and options so we don't have to fight the war. And some of those would be things that are in tune with this Replicator Initiative. Again, Nadia is totally right. It's all about implementation. Do we have real programs in place? Have we settled on the right drone technologies for undersea, on the sea, in the air, drones and missiles and things like that? But then also making use of our legacy systems that we've already invested huge amounts of money in, and which are still very formidable. We have a long-range heavy bomber fleet that is only now finally being incorporated into more scenario planning around Taiwan. Remember, our submarines, which can carry, however many torpedoes to sink Chinese ships, when they run out of those torpedoes, they've got a long, long trip back where they've got to leave the battlefield, and they're going to be out of the fight, and that could be decisive. Heavy bombers can fly in a matter of hours into theater, launch anti-ship missiles from a standoff distance that would give the Chinese Navy a really, really bad day. So there are these legacy systems that can actually be incorporated in more creative ways, and it doesn't require massive new investments. It requires some new investment, and that's why I've been so gobsmacked to see the Biden administration cutting year after year our defense budget. It doesn't make any sense.
Carrie, any thoughts on this?
Matt
We defer
and
to the
Nadia are
master.
total. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
All right. Well, I want to close out in our last 10 minutes here, staying on the question of China, which I think we all agree is the biggest threat that America faces right now, and that is a kind of two-pronged question. And I'll start with you on this, Carrie. One, for the sake of argument, just as a steel man, is the juice worth the squeeze if it came right down to an actual shooting war with China over Taiwan? And then the flip side of that is, I don't know, Matt would know, the last time the PLA fought a war, but is there a potential here that sometimes that we are maybe treating the Chinese like they're 10 feet tall, and we should always be aware that they have their own problems, including one where they haven't had the experience of an actual fighting a war in, I think, 2 generations. So, Carrie, let's start with you on that. Oh, sorry, Matt.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, I was just going to say very, very, very quickly that you're right. The PLA has not had experience in combat really since the late 1970s. A couple incidences in the South China Sea in the 1980s. The paradox, though, is that militaries that don't have much real-world experience in war are sometimes more willing to fight because they've forgotten a lot of the realities of how unpredictable warfare is. So it doesn't make it makes me think that Beijing might be less capable in war, but also more willing to fight.
Okay. That's good. Carrie, what do you think? Juice worth the squeeze, 10 feet tall.
Nothing. There's nothing I like more than being asked a controversial China question and having Matt protect me by jumping in to answer first. Look, I think at the end of the day, there are certainly vulnerabilities that China has, and there have been many scholars who have spoken about what they are, whether it's the economy, whether it's their demographics, whether it's the fact that they don't have that much experience in fighting wars. I think what the United States has historically done very poorly in our foreign policy is understanding the significance of ideology in our adversaries' actions. And so when we look at this question, and I'll go back to Russia, but I will pivot back to China, because I do think all of these things are interrelated. There was this question, we were getting all of the signals, we being the United States, specifically the intelligence community, was getting all these signals that Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine. There were a lot of scholars in Washington, D.C. that still said, up to a few days before the actual invasion, there's no way that Putin would actually do this because, why would he? What would be the potential, benefit? And he's a realistic actor, and he's a rational actor. And he is a rational actor, and a rational actor in his position with his ideology would have done exactly what he did, which is invade Ukraine, particularly given the signals we talked about before with America's retreat from Afghanistan. The reason I bring this up is because China is as ideological, if not more so, than Russia is. And so I think what we need to look at is there a possibility that China does not end up going into Taiwan? Well, they've certainly indicated in all of their behaviors, which are laid out in Matt's book. I feel like I should be saying which is now sold, which you can find wherever books are sold. But at the end of the day, us being prepared is not a bad thing. And us being prepared is also one of the things that would potentially deter China. So I think our foreign policy leaders need to be behaving as if we would be prepared to counter a Chinese invasion. And potentially through that very preparation, through reigniting the arsenal of democracy, through clear and competent diplomatic messaging, we can prevent that very outcome.
Nadia?
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I think it depends on how you define the squeeze. So I would define it as deterrence, as the measures that you need to take to deter. We want to deter. No one wants war.
Obviously.
It would be disastrous for all of us.
Yes. Okay, but I want to get back. I'll give you the last word here, Matt. The first part of my question: what would you say to I don't know, let's call them, like we have in both parties people who are skeptical of what they call the forever wars, and they certainly think that, well, it would be bad, but it's not worth it for us to get in a war with China to defend Taiwan. What would your response be to that?
If we don't want to fight, and I don't want to fight a war with China, right, we have to show that we have that preponderance of decisive power available and that we have the resolve to use it. So it does us very little good to engage in this weird debate. I don't mean that you're weird, but I mean I am seeing a lot of discussion on Twitter about sort of us sort of questioning whether we really want to be a major power in the world anymore, and maybe it's just not worth it anymore. I mean, every time we've indulged that kind of logic, most notably in the 1930s, we ended up having to fight a much bigger war at much higher cost than if we had simply taken some action, in the early phases. I'm thinking of the Rhineland move by Hitler. Right. If the UK and France, with some support from the United States, had taken action, then we might have avoided World War II and the tens of millions of deaths that followed. We now know, that Adolf Hitler was terrified. That he was never more worried than he was in those 24 hours that followed his move into the Rhineland. He thought that could end up spelling the end of his new Reich. Instead, the world said, geez, I just don't think it's worth it. And then it was only a few years later that tens of millions had to die and suffer. So that's my answer.
Is that before we talk about whether we would or we wouldn't, we should just prepare as if we will. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Show that Japan, look, Japan is a swing state in this, right? I mean, Japan has a formidable navy. It'd be like adding a whole, another Seventh Fleet to the United States. Japan should be training more closely than we are with the United States. We should be involving Taiwan, Australia, showing that we are building muscle memory to be able to decisively and confidently win an engagement. Xi Jinping is not insane. He's incompetent in many ways, but he's not stupid and he's not insane. If Xi Jinping sees that rolling the dice is going to result in snake eyes and in him and maybe even his old Marxist party going the way of the dodo, he's not going to attempt a war. And so we should give him every reason to doubt the utility of war, because I think he is deterrable.
All right, I got 2.5 minutes left, but I got to ask, what do you say to the Elbridge Colbys who say, exactly, and that's why we need to appease Russia, because we really need to make the point in China, which is, sort of, he would agree with you. He said, like, well, you're right, we need to deter Xi, but we can't really deter Xi if we still act as if all of these other conflicts are in our interest.
Sure. Well, look, Bridge is right that the essence of strategy is prioritization and deprioritization.
Right.
I think where he and I have some disagreement is what is the thing that we need to prioritize. I would argue that it is deterrence across the board, and that you don't need to make a choice right now. Remember, we're not committing troops to fight in Europe. Europe is fighting its own war. They're just asking for some support for that. I think that is an economical sort of proposition for us to support Europe in its fight, namely the Ukrainians, so that we don't have a collapse of deterrence more broadly. If Ukraine does fall because Europe, other European nations besides Ukraine and the United States showed insufficient will, I think the cost will be even higher for us, even in terms of the military outlays we're going to have to make to now defend a much harder border with this bulge of Russian-occupied Ukraine stabbing right into the heart of Europe. That's going to be an even bigger draw on our defense spending and on troop levels and on equipment, having to go shore up the NATO line. The cheaper way to fight this thing is to win the war that Putin gave us.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank our panel, Matt Pottinger, Carrie Filipetti, and Nadia Schadlow. Thank you guys so much. This was great.
Thank you.